There are a lot of people out there who are new to building their own blasters, from DIY kits or for hardware or from prints that they've made themselves. And we get a lot of questions about what's the best build to start with. So in general, spring or power blasters are the easiest because usually they're modular and you slide the pieces together and they just work. There's a lot less tinkering that has to be done usually with them as compared to flywheel blasters. You also don't have any soldering, which can be a difficult skill to learn for beginners. The Talon Claw, Caliburn, and other designs like Captain Slug, for example, are some of the best blasters that go together with the fewest amount of tweaking and sanding, filing. He designed his parts with pretty good tolerances, so if your prints are a little off, your hardware's a little crooked, usually you can make it work. The Mistress Key is also a good example of this because of the way it's built. It's modular. The Spring Thunder is a little more difficult though because it has more parts, smaller pieces, little latches and springs that you have to maybe adjust or file or sand to get just right. But once you know what you're doing, it goes together pretty well and pretty quick. The FDL is actually a flywheel blaster that fits in that category as well, because if you get the hardware and you print the parts, it goes together pretty quickly as well. It's mostly just screwing things together, plugging things in, maybe it's filing or sanding prints that came out a little iffy or elephant's foot, but it goes together more quickly than most flywheel blasters because there's not as much soldering if you get the parts pre-soldered. Other spring blasters, such as the Rainbow, though, are a little bit more difficult because the holes in the main tube need to be drilled in the right location. So instead of being one build where the pieces fit together and they slide together, the Rainbow is built around one tube. And so if the holes are misaligned or crooked, then it can be really hard to get things to line up. But if you get your kit pre-drilled and ready to assemble, it does go together pretty quick with just a couple of screws. So yeah, so spring power blasters are the easiest. Flywheel blasters, such as FTW builds like the Snake, the Mamba, then we have the Bulwark, Lepus, and some of the other ones, Pigeon, Magpie. They're a bit more complicated. The Snake is probably the easiest of them with the fewest parts and the least amount of soldering joints you have to worry about. However, there can be some parts to sand and file, and soldering itself is a skill that you can practice and develop, and it can be a little difficult to know the soldering patterns or diagrams on what goes where when you're first starting out. There's a handful of different possibilities depending on who designed the build you're working on with where to solder certain connections, and that can be a bit difficult, but once you know what you're doing, it does go pretty quick. And all of those builds, the Snake, the Mamba, the Bulwark, they're pretty similar in their process of building. They may be different in their execution. However, the fundamentals are the same for most flywheel blasters. I didn't talk about the Chimera yet. It's technically a spring power blaster, but it does take some tweaking, especially with the old original file set. It'll take some filing and some sanding and some adjusting of the trigger mechanism. So I find it overall a little bit more difficult than your basic electric blaster. If you have soldering experience, those electric blasters can come together pretty quickly. But the difficulty of dealing with a finicky spring-powered system can kind of outweigh the difficulty of electric system. The Woozi is another one of those electric ones that the Woozi is a little bit more. It goes together easier, but there's more parts involved than say a Bulwark or a Lepus, and so that's a little bit more difficult build. However, the designer did a really good job of making sure things fit with minimal amount of sanding and adjusting. The rest of the builds, we have some HPA like the Tempest, the U-Talon Claw, the Waymaker. A lot of those other HPA builds are actually pretty easy, pretty simple once you know what you're doing. It's mostly just pipe fittings. You kind of have to know how to seal, check for leaks, and how to maybe adjust your supercore if you're using one, or just how the system works all together. But most of the builds are just about as easy as the Caliburn as far as how the parts fit together. But most of those designs, other than the Tempest, will use more screws and hardware, which can make the overall build a little more complicated in knowing what to do first. But the actual how it works, the internals, and bolting things together. That's pretty simple stuff after you know the basics. Some of the hardest builds I would have to say would have to be if you do anything with brass, and a brass breech, brass barrel itself, and a brass breech that's built on a system that's aligned just right can be pretty easy. However, for example, a Caliburn or Talon Claw, because there can be a lot of play in the position and alignment of parts, it can be difficult to get the brass aligned correctly. So it can be finicky, and if you do it wrong, you might have to start completely over, which can be frustrating. And so brass can be finicky and frustrating. A lot of revolver type blasters can be as well, not as bad as brass, but the Viper and the Magpie, for example, if your prints don't come out super great or you're using files that are less optimized, it can be hard to get the timing of the cylinders correct. But that usually just takes some filing and sanding and providing clearance for the parts that need to have clearance. If things are too tight or too loose, it can slip on the rotation. So if you know anything about corded blasters, which are similar to the cylinder revolver type blaster, like the AET, the AirTech 2000 or 3000 back in the day, the Doomsayer, they use a turret system that rotates, and getting that alignment to seal right with a spring-powered system is pretty challenging and can be frustrating. The Magpie though and the Viper, they are flywheel-powered blasters, so there's a lot less error that can go. You just need to rotate the drum and push the dart, which is easier to do, but still a lot more finicky than a mag-fed blaster like Pigeon, where you just throw the mag in and pull the trigger. There's less moving parts, so it can be easier to build a non-cylinder blaster. The Pigeon I put kind of down on the list as well, because there can be some filing or sanding with the Mark 8 to get the blowback slide, especially if you're using the lever or the recoil blowback instead of the geared blowback. Those can take a lot of sanding, especially if your prints came out a little warped. A little bit of warping can take a lot of sanding to fix. It's not impossible, but it would be a weekend project, not an afternoon project. And so the Pigeon and the Magpie can take some tinkering with. So with the right optimizations, you can have a really good time with putting a weekend project together. And if you have questions or comments or concerns about your build, we have build guide videos. Our customer support may take a little bit to get back to you, but usually we're pretty good at responding to build questions. There's plenty of Facebook groups and social media platforms out there that you can ask for help as well. In all of these builds, there's a pretty good support for. More people have built these than just a few people, so you can get some good insight there. And if you order something from us, either a DIY kit or a hardware kit or a printed parts kit, or asks for it, you'll get an email with the links to the updated files and to the build guides and some tips and tricks and stuff like that. It's not spam. It should be helpful. You can always unsubscribe, I think.
People really like those.
But you're automatically subscribed when you order. Can you unsubscribe from those automatic emails?
Yes. When you get your first one about lead time, you can unsubscribe right there.
There you go. You can unsubscribe if you don't want anything.
Hardly anybody unsubscribes.
Well, I guess you probably won't want to unsubscribe. You guys will be in good hands. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. Hopefully we'll be able to accommodate your requests, design changes and tweaks, and future designs or ideas. I've got a couple of ideas of my own that I've yet to have time to work on. I'm talking like Iron Man level cool stuff, like Hawkeye. He's my favorite because he's actually the first superhero in all of the Marvel series who has a family and kids and a wife, and like he has been able to balance his life, superhero and family life. I think that's actually a great role model. But I just realized he's a really charactered individual. Yeah, he goes out, but I think Hawkeye is honestly, anyway. So we got some cool stuff coming. So stay tuned.